November 19, 1943. The Imperial Japanese Navy Ministry, Tokyo. The morning sun filtered through the reinforced windows of the naval headquarters, casting long shadows across polished wooden floors that had once echoed with the confident footsteps of victorious admirals. Vice Admiral Fukudome Shigeru sat alone in a briefing room, a half-empty cup of green tea growing cold beside him. Before him lay a folder stamped in red ink. Most Secret. Industrial Production Analysis, United States of America. January-September 1943. His hands, steady through 100 Janlu meetings, trembled slightly as he turned the first page. The numbers did not make sense. They could not make sense, and yet they were verified by 3 independent intelligence sources. In the silence of that Tokyo morning, 22 months after Pearl Harbor, the mythology that had carried an empire into war began to crumble like ash in the wind. The cup of tea, that simple vessel of ceremony and contemplation, would sit untouched as Fukudome read through the afternoon. By evening, it would be stone cold, much like the certainty that had once burned in the hearts of Japan's military leadership. That cup, refilled countless times throughout the war years, would become a silent witness to the gradual, agonizing realization that they had awakened something vast, something industrial, something utterly beyond the scope of their most pessimistic calculations. To understand the earthquake that occurred in that briefing room, one must first journey backward to the moment when confidence stood at its zenith. December 7, 1941, was not merely an attack. It was a declaration rooted in a specific worldview, a calculated gamble built upon assumptions that seemed, at the time, entirely reasonable. The architects of Japan's southern expansion had studied America carefully, or so they believed. They had seen the breadlines of the Great Depression, the labor strikes, the isolationist sentiment echoing through Congress. They had observed an American military ranked 17th in the world, behind Portugal and Romania. They had watched newsreels of a soft, comfort-addicted populace more interested in Hollywood fantasies than martial discipline. Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku, architect of Pearl Harbor, had walked the streets of Harvard and Washington. He had lived in America, learned its language, absorbed its culture. His warning to his colleagues was famous, often quoted but rarely heeded in its full meaning. I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve. But even Yamamoto, with his American education and first-hand observations, could not fully grasp the scale of what was coming. His calculations were tactical, measured in carriers and battleships and months. He estimated that Japan had perhaps 12 to 18 months to secure a defensive perimeter so formidable that America would negotiate rather than pay the blood price of dislodging them. 18 months to win a war. It was not an unreasonable assessment, given what they knew, but what they knew was catastrophically incomplete. The Japanese High Command had constructed their strategy upon pillars they believed to be unshakable. The first pillar, American industrial capacity, while impressive on paper, was devoted to consumer frivolities, automobiles, refrigerators, radios. Converting such production to military hardware would require years, perhaps a decade. The second pillar, American society, fractured by racial tensions and class divisions, lacked the cohesive will necessary for total war. The third pillar, American soldiers raised in comfort and prosperity, would not endure the hardships that Japanese troops embraced as spiritual necessity. These were not wild fantasies, they were intelligence assessments built from observable data. They were also entirely, devastatingly, wrong. In those first months after Pearl Harbor, the assumptions seemed validated. Wake Island fell. Guam fell. The Philippines, America's proudest colonial possession, crumbled under the Japanese onslaught. Singapore, the British Gibraltar of the East, surrendered in what Churchill would call the worst disaster in British military history. By May 1942, Japan controlled an empire spanning from the borders of India to the Central Pacific, an area encompassing 1/6 of the Earth's surface. In Tokyo, in the officers' clubs where sake flowed freely, toasts were raised to inevitable victory. The Americans had been bloodied, humiliated, sent reeling back across the Pacific. Surely now they would see reason. Surely now they would negotiate. But in Detroit, in Pittsburgh, in the shipyards of California and the aircraft factories of Kansas, something else was happening. Something the Japanese intelligence services had noted, but fundamentally misunderstood. The automotive plants were indeed converting to military production, but not slowly, not gradually. Henry Ford's Willow Run plant, built in mere months, would produce one B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes at its peak. One bomber, with its thousands of precision components, every single hour. The phoenix of American industry was not rising slowly from Depression-era ashes. It was exploding into existence with a speed and scale that defied every historical precedent. Vice Admiral Fukudome, in that November briefing room, stared at the figures that detailed this transformation. In 1943 alone, just that single year, the United States would produce more than 85,000 aircraft. The entire Japanese aviation industry, straining every resource, every factory, every skilled worker, would produce approximately 16,000. The numbers carved themselves into his consciousness like a blade. American shipyards were launching a new destroyer every week, a new escort carrier every 5 days. Liberty ships, those ungainly cargo vessels carrying the sinews of war, were being produced so rapidly that their production time had dropped from 244 days to 42 days. With one ship, the SS Robert E. Peary, completed in an impossible 4 days and 15 hours from keel laying to launch. These were not projections. These were documented facts, verified and re-verified because the intelligence officers themselves could not believe them. The United States was producing more war material in a single month than Japan could produce in a year, and the acceleration was still increasing. What the Japanese military leadership had expected was a mirror image of their own experience. They expected America to tighten its belt, to ration, to sacrifice, to pour every resource into the war effort at the expense of civilian comfort. They expected the American people to endure what Japanese civilians endured. Rice rations cut to near starvation levels, metal donated to the war effort down to family cooking pots, clothing that was patched and repatched until it fell apart. This shared suffering, they believed, was the price of total war. Any nation fighting seriously must pay it. Instead, reports filtering back from intelligence sources painted an incomprehensible picture. American civilians were experiencing rationing, yes, but rationing of abundance. Sugar was limited but still available. Gasoline was restricted, but most families still had automobiles. Meat required stamps, but Americans were consuming more protein than most Japanese soldiers in the field. Coffee, chocolate, cigarettes, luxuries that Japanese troops dreamed of, were standard issue for every American GI. A single American soldier's daily ration contained more calories and nutritional variety than a Japanese officer's weekly allocation. The contrast was not merely material, it was philosophical. It struck at the heart of what Japan's military culture had taught for generations. The Imperial Army had built its identity on spiritual superiority over material weakness. Japanese soldiers were trained to view hardship as purifying, hunger as character-building, death as transcendent purpose. They were taught that American softness, American love of comfort, would crumble when tested by Japanese willpower. A soldier who could survive on a handful of rice per day was spiritually superior to one who required 3 meals. An army that embraced death was inevitably superior to one that clung to life. But what happened when the soft American soldier was also supported by an industrial base so vast that it could afford to feed him steak, equip him with the finest weapons, and transport him in vehicles that Japanese generals could only envy? What happened when material abundance did not produce weakness, but rather confidence, morale, and an expectation of victory? The Battle of Midway in June 1942 should have been the first clear warning, but its lessons were obscured by tactical analysis. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers in a single day, a catastrophic blow. But the official reports focused on tactical errors, on bad luck, on the fortunes of war. What was not fully grasped was the strategic implication. America could replace its losses. Japan could not. The USS Yorktown, damaged at the Coral Sea, was repaired in 48 hours, a miracle of industrial effort that would have taken Japanese shipyards months. And when Yorktown was finally sunk at Midway, America's response was not to husband resources or carefully rebuild. It was to lay down keels for 24 new fleet carriers. 24? Japan would build 7 carriers in the entire remaining war. By 1943, the mathematical inevitability was becoming clear to anyone willing to see it. Colonel Tsuji Masanobu, architect of the Malayan campaign, had written early in the war that the enemy's materials are abundant, but their men are effete. It was a comfort, this belief in spiritual superiority. But that comfort was being systematically destroyed by the grinding reality of industrial warfare. At Guadalcanal, Japanese soldiers discovered that American forces could call down artillery support with a lavishness that seemed obscene. Shells fell not in carefully rationed salvos, but in endless cascades of steel and explosive. When Japanese positions were identified, the American response was not to carefully plan an assault. It was to obliterate the position with firepower until nothing living remained. A Japanese officer captured on Tarawa, when questioned about American tactics, said something that was recorded in the intelligence files, but whose full significance was only later appreciated. He said, "You do not fight like soldiers. You fight like industrialists." It was meant as an insult, a comment on American lack of warrior spirit. But it contained a truth more profound than he realized. America was indeed fighting like industrialists, because America was approaching war as an industrial problem to be solved with industrial solutions. The cup of tea on Fukudome's desk remained untouched as the afternoon shadows lengthened. He had reached the section on American training and logistics. Every American division in the Pacific was supported by an infrastructure that seemed wastefully extravagant. Every soldier was trained with live ammunition, not a few precious rounds, but hundreds. American pilots trained for hundreds of hours before seeing combat. Japanese pilots, by 1943, were being rushed to the front with perhaps 40 hours of flight time. Simply because there was no fuel to spare for extended training, no aircraft that could be wasted on instruction, when they were desperately needed at the front. The report detailed American field hospitals with surgery, capabilities that rivaled the finest civilian hospitals in Tokyo. It described entire refrigerated ships carrying nothing but food. It documented the existence of mobile laundries, postal systems that delivered letters from home with remarkable regularity, even special services units whose sole purpose was to provide entertainment and maintain morale. To Japanese commanders accustomed to ordering soldiers to live off the land or die trying, this logistical elaboration seemed not just excessive, but somehow morally wrong. War was supposed to be hard. Suffering was supposed to be meaningful. But the Americans had inverted the equation. They had decided that suffering was inefficient. A well-fed soldier fought better than a starving one. A soldier who knew his wounds would be treated fought with more confidence than one who knew injury meant slow death. A military that maintained morale fought with more cohesion than one that relied solely on discipline and fear. These were not revolutionary insights. They were obvious truths that Japanese military culture had rejected in favor of spiritual mysticism. The symbolic power of that cup of tea, refilled morning after morning in military headquarters across Japan, represented the gap between philosophy and reality. Tea ceremony was about finding beauty in simplicity, meaning in restraint. It was a cultural value that had been militarized into a virtue of sacrifice. But it was a virtue that could not build carriers. It could not smelt steel. It could not replace the 2,000 trained pilots lost in 1943 or the 3,500 who would be lost in 1944. Spiritual purity did not stop bullets or heal shrapnel wounds. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, grimly nicknamed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot by American pilots, the mathematical reality became apocalyptic. Japan sent 373 carrier aircraft into battle. Only 130 returned. American losses, 29 aircraft. It was not even a contest. It was an execution. Japanese pilots, poorly trained and flying obsolescent aircraft, were shot from the sky by American aviators who had trained for 1,000 hours. Flying aircraft produced at a rate of 1 every 5 minutes, somewhere in America's vast industrial heartland. The realization, when it fully dawned on the Japanese high command, was not a single moment but a cascade of comprehensions, each one more devastating than the last. First came the understanding that America's industrial capacity had been catastrophically underestimated. Second came the recognition that this capacity was still accelerating. Third came the awareness that American military culture, far from being soft, had its own ruthless efficiency. Fourth came the terrible knowledge that there was no path to victory, only questions about the terms of defeat. In the winter of 1944, Admiral Yonai Mitsumasa, Navy Minister, said in a private meeting that was later recorded in diaries, "We have awakened not a sleeping giant, but an entire sleeping continent of giants." It was a paraphrase of Yamamoto's prophecy, but with a crucial difference. Yamamoto had imagined a single adversary of great strength. Yonai had realized that America's power was not consolidated in a military elite, but distributed across an entire industrial civilization that had simply decided to pivot its enormous productive capacity toward war. The documents on Fukudome's desk included captured American magazines, analyzed for intelligence value. The analysts had noted something that seemed, at first, trivial. American women's magazines from 1943 contained advertisements for luxury goods, perfumes, jewelry, fine clothing that were still being manufactured despite the war. Not everything had been converted to military production. The American economy was so vast that it could simultaneously produce more war material than any nation in history, while also maintaining a civilian standard of living that exceeded most countries' peacetime prosperity. This was not a nation straining at the limits of its capacity. This was a nation operating at perhaps 3/4 of its theoretical maximum. And that 3/4 effort was crushing Japan's total commitment. The psychological impact of this realization cannot be overstated. Japanese military ideology had prepared its officers for honorable defeat in equal combat. It had prepared them to overcome material disadvantage through spiritual superiority. It had not prepared them for the discovery that they were not fighting a rival, but an entirely different category of industrial power. It was as if a medieval army, however brave and skilled, had suddenly found itself facing modern mechanized forces. The terms of combat themselves had changed. Intelligence reports from prisoners taken in late 1944 revealed another dimension of the problem. American soldiers, when captured, were often puzzled by their captors' expectations. Japanese interrogators would ask about hardships, expecting tales of deprivation that would confirm their beliefs about American supply problems. Instead, they heard complaints about the coffee being poor quality, or the mail being delayed, or the movie showings being infrequent. One American prisoner, when asked about supply shortages, genuinely did not understand the question. The concept of shortage was foreign to his experience. He had never once wondered if ammunition would be available, or if food would arrive, or if reinforcements would come. These things simply happened, as reliable as sunrise. This certainty, This absolute confidence in the industrial base supporting them was itself a weapon. American soldiers fought with an assurance that their Japanese counterparts, no matter how brave, could not match. They knew that if they were wounded, they would be evacuated and treated. They knew that if equipment broke, it would be replaced. They knew that their nation's productive capacity was so vast that no single battle, no single defeat would exhaust it. This knowledge shaped tactics, morale, and ultimately outcomes. The symbolic cup of tea appeared again in a report from Saipan, July 1944. A Japanese officer preparing for a final banzai charge wrote a last letter that was later found on his body. He described sharing tea with his remaining men, a ritual of tranquility before death. He wrote of finding peace in simplicity, of accepting fate with dignity. It was beautiful in its way, a perfect expression of Bushido philosophy. But it was also an epitaph for an ideology that could not comprehend, much less compete with, an enemy whose solution to problems was not spiritual acceptance, but industrial overwhelm. American forces, securing Saipan, found the letter. They also found warehouses that Japanese troops had been forbidden to touch, supplies reserved for a retreat that High Command had refused to authorize until it was too late. Meanwhile, American forces were receiving ice cream, not as a rare treat, but regularly. The Navy had commissioned concrete barges whose sole purpose was to manufacture and deliver ice cream to troops in the Pacific. Ice cream in a war zone, to Japanese soldiers who had not seen fresh meat in months, who were chewing on tree bark to stave off starvation. The existence of floating ice cream factories was not just material superiority. It was a demonstration that they were fighting an enemy from a different industrial epoch. By late 1944, internal Japanese documents show a shift in language. Earlier reports had spoken of temporary setbacks and tactical adjustments. Now, they spoke of endurance and national spirit and honorable terms. The mathematical reality had become inescapable. Admiral Toyoda Soemu, commander of the Combined Fleet, wrote in October 1944, "We are now fighting with bamboo spears against artillery." It was a dramatic metaphor, but not an exaggeration. Japan's aircraft production was collapsing. Fuel reserves were critical. Pilot training had been reduced to barely enough to allow takeoffs and landings. Meanwhile, American production continued to accelerate. The invasion of the Philippines saw the U.S. Navy deploy a fleet larger than the entire Japanese Navy at its peak strength. And this fleet was merely one of several major operational groups. The realization that came to Fukudome and others in the High Command was ultimately about civilizational capacity. Japan had mobilized completely, had embraced total war, had demanded absolute sacrifice from its population. And it was not enough. It was not remotely enough. The United States had mobilized partially, had maintained substantial civilian prosperity, had fought with what amounted to a fraction of its theoretical maximum effort. And that fraction was so overwhelming that no amount of Japanese courage, skill, or sacrifice could balance the equation. In December 1944, Minister of War Korechika Anami received a report on American bomber production. The Boeing plant in Seattle alone was producing more B-29 superfortresses than Japan's entire aircraft industry was producing planes of all types. Each B-29 was a technological marvel that Japan could not replicate, carrying bomb loads that exceeded anything in the Japanese arsenal, flying at altitudes Japanese fighters struggled to reach, equipped with remote-controlled defensive turrets that represented automated sophistication Japan's industry could not approach. And these aircraft were being produced at a rate of 100 per month from a single factory complex. The report included photographs, obtained through neutral sources, of the Boeing plant. Anami studied them in silence. The factory was so vast it required internal weather control systems. It employed 30,000 workers, most of them women, who had been trained in months to do work that Japanese craftsmen required years to master. The photographs showed not strained effort, not desperate round-the-clock emergency measures, but organized, systematic, efficient production. There was a cafeteria visible in one photo, with what appeared to be workers on a lunch break. They did not look like a nation at the breaking point. They looked like a nation barely inconvenienced by the process of producing world historical quantities of the most advanced weapons on Earth. What do you say when you finally understand that you are not fighting an enemy, but an entire industrial civilization operating at a level your own civilization cannot reach? What do you say when spiritual devotion, tactical brilliance, and absolute sacrifice are revealed to be insufficient against an opponent who approaches war as an engineering problem and solves it with resources so vast that they seem almost casual in their application? The historical record shows that different leaders said different things. Some retreated into mysticism, insisting that spirit would somehow triumph over steel. Some advocated for increasingly desperate measures, kamikaze attacks that traded irreplaceable pilots for marginal tactical gains. Some, in private moments, acknowledged the truth that could not be spoken publicly. The war had been lost not at Midway, not at Guadalcanal, not at any battle, but in the fundamental miscalculation of what kind of enemy they faced. Admiral Onishi Takejiro, father of the Kamikaze Corps, said in early 1945, "We are sending our young men to die because we cannot send them to win." It was a confession of bankruptcy, moral, strategic, industrial. The kamikaze was not a weapon of strength, but of desperation, a tactic born from the realization that conventional combat had become impossible. A single American carrier group could deploy more fighters than the entire Japanese Air Force could concentrate in one place. Attacking such a force conventionally was suicide. Attacking it with intentional suicide at least had the virtue of certainty. The pilot would not return, but the aircraft might reach the target. The cup of tea on Fukudome's desk had long since grown cold when he reached the final section of the report. Projections for 1945. The numbers defied comprehension. American production would exceed 1944 levels. American naval strength would double. American air forces would achieve total air superiority over the home islands. And these projections assumed no increase in American effort. They were simply the product of systems already in motion, factories already built, workers already trained, ships already launched. In the face of such numbers, what sustained Japanese resistance was no longer hope of victory, but something more fundamental: the need to make defeat mean something. If the war was lost, and by early 1945, even the most fanatical advocates knew it was lost, then perhaps the manner of losing could extract better terms. Perhaps bloodying the Americans sufficiently would make them offer concessions. Perhaps demonstrating absolute unwillingness to surrender would make invasion seem too costly. It was a strategy built not on winning, but on making the winning so expensive that the victor would accept less than total victory. But even this hope was based on a miscalculation, one final misunderstanding of American industrial logic. The United States had already calculated the cost of invasion. It had calculated the casualties, the time, the resources required, and it had deemed those costs acceptable. Moreover, it was preparing alternatives. The Manhattan Project, unknown to Japanese intelligence, was approaching completion. The industrial civilization that produced a bomber every 63 minutes had also produced, in secret facilities across the country, a weapon so powerful that its existence would have seemed like science fiction to planners trained in conventional warfare. When two such weapons destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, they were not merely bombs. They were statements. They said, "We have such industrial capacity that we can invent entirely new categories of weapons, manufacture them in secret, and deploy them while still maintaining all our conventional war efforts." They said, "You misunderstood not just our current strength, but our potential strength, our capacity for innovation, our ability to bring theoretical physics into practical engineering within the time frame of a single war. The final words of the Japanese High Command, as recorded in the documents surrounding surrender, contained a recurring acknowledgement. Foreign Minister Togo Shigeru, in communications with the Emperor, spoke of facing a nation whose power we failed to comprehend. War Minister Anami, even as he argued for continued resistance, acknowledged that we did not understand what we awakened. The mystical language of awakening giants recurred because the metaphor captured something that precise military terminology could not. The sense of having opened a door that should have remained closed, of having provoked a response so overwhelming that it revealed the provocation itself to have been a category error. In the years after the war, surviving Japanese officers would write memoirs trying to explain the inexplicable. How had their intelligence been so wrong? How had their assumptions been so catastrophically flawed? The answers varied, but certain themes emerged. They had studied American military weakness, but not American industrial strength. They had analyzed American social divisions, but not American civic cohesion when threatened. They had understood American love of comfort, but not American capacity to harness comfort itself as a military advantage. They had seen the Depression-era breadlines, but not the industrial infrastructure that those breadlines represented, an economy so productive that even its collapse produced more wealth than most nations' prosperity. Vice Admiral Fukudome, in his post-war writings, returned again and again to that November day in 1943 when he read the production reports. He described it as the day he understood the war was lost, though the war would continue for another 21 months. He wrote, "We had prepared to fight America. We had not prepared to fight American industry, American agriculture, American logistics, American training systems, American innovation, and American capacity to improve and accelerate all these things while fighting. We prepared to face a nation. We faced a civilization in industrial prime. The cup of tea, that symbol of ceremony, of simplicity, of finding abundance in restraint, became in his memory a symbol of the gap between cultural value and strategic reality. There was beauty in the tea ceremony, in the careful preparation, in the mindfulness and restraint. But beauty did not forge steel. Ceremony did not build ships. Simplicity did not train pilots. The values that made tea ceremony meaningful were not the values that won industrial wars. And yet, Fukudome noted, American soldiers also valued simple pleasures. They treasured coffee as Japanese officers treasured tea. They wrote letters home about ordinary things, family dinners they missed, baseball games they would attend after the war, the normalcy they fought to return to. The difference was not in the existence of such values, but in the industrial system supporting them. American soldiers could value coffee because coffee was always available. They could dream of normalcy because their nation's industrial capacity ensured that normalcy would still exist when they returned. Japanese soldiers learned to value scarcity, to find meaning in absence, because presence could not be guaranteed. In the end, what the Japanese High Command said when they finally understood American power was this: they had mistaken a nation at peace for a nation incapable of war. They had confused consumer abundance with military weakness. They had believed that a people accustomed to comfort could not endure hardship, when in fact American industrial culture simply refused to accept hardship as necessary. Why should soldiers go hungry when the nation could produce more food than they could eat? Why should they lack ammunition when factories could produce it faster than they could fire it? Why should they die of treatable wounds when medical capacity could be deployed to prevent it? These were not rhetorical questions, they were engineering problems, and America had solved them with engineering solutions. The result was a military force that fought with the confidence of absolute material superiority, supported by an industrial base that treated supplying that force as a solvable logistics problem rather than an insurmountable challenge. The epilogue to this realization is written not in the surrender documents, but in what came after. Japan, in defeat, learned the lesson that its military leadership had failed to grasp in time. Industrial capacity, technological innovation, and efficient systems mattered more than martial spirit. The post-war economic miracle that transformed Japan into an industrial powerhouse was built on this understanding. But that understanding was purchased at a price measured in millions of lives and the ashes of cities. That cup of tea, cold on a Tokyo desk in November 1943, represented the moment when mythology met mathematics and shattered. It stood for all the beautiful, meaningful cultural values that could not, in themselves, overcome the brute calculus of industrial production. It symbolized the painful discovery that good intentions, noble purpose, and absolute dedication were insufficient when confronting an opponent who had mastered the art of turning industrial plenty into military supremacy. The Americans, for their part, never fully grasped how alien their abundance appeared to their enemies. To American soldiers, the supply lines were just background reality. The food came, the ammunition arrived, the reinforcements appeared. These were no more remarkable than sunrise. They could not conceive of an army that lacked these things, that fought while hungry, that rationed bullets, that had no expectation of medical evacuation. The luxury of their position was invisible to them, as fundamental as air. But to Japanese officers reading production reports, to soldiers discovering American field rations, to pilots facing the endless waves of American aircraft, that abundance was a revelation. It spoke of a kind of power that could not be defeated because it operated from assumptions that made defeat nearly impossible. When your enemy can replace losses faster than you can inflict them, when they can supply troops more lavishly than you can supply commanders, when they treat as disposable what you would treasure as precious, how do you win? The answer, reached painfully and far too late, was that you do not. You could not have won. The premises of the war were false from the first moment. In the end, what the Japanese High Command said was less important than what they could not say, could not admit even to themselves until forced to by overwhelming evidence. They had not merely lost a war, they had lost before the war began, because they had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of modern industrial warfare. They had brought spiritual certainty to a material contest and discovered that spirit alone, however pure, could not forge the steel, grow the food, train the pilots, and build the ships necessary to fight a nation that treated such production as merely another industrial problem to be optimized and solved. The cold tea stood as witness to that realization, a symbol of all that was beautiful and insufficient in the face of industrial modernity. And in its coldness was a truth that would echo far beyond that Tokyo briefing room, far beyond the Pacific War, that in the modern age, cultural values matter less than industrial capacity, that good intentions cannot overcome material disadvantage, and that understanding your enemy means understanding not just their military, but their entire civilizational infrastructure, their farms and factories, their training systems and supply chains, their capacity not just to fight, but to sustain fighting at a scale that transforms war itself. This was what they finally understood. This was what they said, in memos and reports, and private conversations recorded in diaries and memoirs. And this was what they could never fully articulate, that they had not fought and lost to America, but had fought and been overwhelmed by the industrial future itself, which had arrived not with philosophical arguments, but with Liberty ships and B-29s and carrier task forces and production capacity so vast, it seemed to mock the very concept of resource constraints. Against such power, spiritual purity was not meaningless, but it was not enough. It had never been enough. And the realization of that insufficiency, that gap between cultural value and strategic reality, was the true moment of defeat, not at Hiroshima, but in that Tokyo briefing room, when the numbers finally could not be denied, and the cold tea sat untouched, as the November shadows lengthened and the war, already lost, ground on toward its inevitable conclusion.